For 2023, the most popular Lexus in America is going to offer you not one, not two, but three different hybrid systems and even the availability of a plug should you so desire. Over here, power levels are mild at 246 horsepower. Over here in this very 1980s rose gold color, power level is definitely wild for the Lexus RX at a total of 366 horsepower and an all-new kind of hybrid system for Lexus, because this combines a turbocharger, an electric motor up front, a 6-speed automatic transmission, and an electric motor in the back. If you didn't already know it, that means that this is the Lexus RX 500h F-Sport Performance all-wheel drive. This one, a lot easier to say, this is the RX 350h. Park them next to each other and you'll immediately notice the difference between the RX 350h and the RX 500h F-Sport Performance all-wheel drive. Definitely a mouthful again. This has the distinctive F-Sport squiggles, slight change to the squiggles for the new RX model, and you can see a little bit less body color section going on up here on the top of the spindle grille. Interesting twist, this is a little less spindly than before because this upper section is body colored, it still has the cut line, but that's really all the grille you're getting. This blends a bit more at the front end, whereas this definitely is a bit more prominent, but pretty similar features on both of these vehicles. This one does not have the available tri-module LED headlights. You can get the same headlights in both. This one has incandescent turn signals, this one has LEDs. Dimensionally, the new RX Hybrid is almost exactly the same size as the outgoing RX Hybrid, but it certainly looks different from a lot of angles. And some of this is optical illusion, because to my eye in person, it looks smaller than the old model parked right next to it. It is in fact, again, almost exactly the same size. Part of that is because the roofline is a little bit lower, but only 4/10 of an inch, surprisingly. Part of that is also because the hood is a little bit longer, giving this maybe more of a station wagon kind of vibe than it had in the past. You can really see the length of the hood here. It is very, very long. Some of that's obviously overhang, but some of it is because they've deliberately pushed the pillars backwards to give this that stretched proportion. The one dimension that has significantly changed, however, is the wheelbase. It is considerably longer than the outgoing model. It's been pushed around by about 3 inches, so it's a little bit further forward and a whole lot further rearward in this model. There is a bit of an homage to the outgoing Lexus RXL back here in this rear window, but importantly, there is no 3-row version of the RX in this generation. And that's because there's going to be an upcoming dedicated 3-row crossover at some point, we keep being told, but at this moment, no 3-row hybrid or non-hybrid RX. Out back, we find a few styling elements repeated from up front, like this little Nike swoosh going on here. It's meant to mimic the DRL shape up front, and then there's some individual elements in the tail lamp module that help dress it up a bit. Down at the bottom, we get the F-Sport squiggles over here, but no faux exhaust vents. They're all tucked up underneath the rear bumper. For the 350, they've removed the squiggles and they've instead given us this gray bumper section, which certainly looks more attractive than some of the lower end trim RXs that I was driving earlier today that just have a plain black bumper section right back here. You'll find that in the F-Sport trim of the regular non-hybrid turbo model, if you're following me there. You'll find the exhaust tips tucked up underneath the bumper, and this has the optional hitch receiver right there in the middle. Not all the specifications on the new RX are final, so the ones on the side of your screen, those are going to be the correct numbers. The ones coming out of my mouth are going to be in the ballpark, subject to change based on a final release before this video goes live. You should also know that legroom, headroom, and cargo room figures are not available yet for the Lexus RX. We're going to talk about that, but none of those numbers are set in stone, again, until you're watching this video, so pay attention to the sidebar. Under this hood, the RX 350, we find a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder hybrid system. Pretty much the same one that we find in a wide variety of different Lexus and Toyota models, very similar to what we find in the Lexus NX. Under this hood, the system produces 246 horsepower, 233 pound-feet of torque, and it will give you 36 miles per gallon combined. The design of this hybrid system is basically the same as the outgoing RX, except that we have a smaller engine over here. So we still have a 2-motor planetary power split system over here, and then a separate electric motor in the back. So some people call this a CVT. In the traditional sense, it's not really even a transmission, but it does have that similar feel. 0 to 60, 7.4 seconds this one, and again, 36 miles per gallon. For the ultimate in RX performance, we have this model with the mile-long name and an entirely different kind of hybrid system. Very unique for Lexus and pretty similar to what we find in BMW, Volvo, and Mercedes hybrids. Over there on that side, we find a 2.4-liter turbocharged engine. basically the same turbo that we find in the regular Lexus RX. On this side, we find a 6-speed automatic transmission, and then placed between them, we have a single electric motor. Then there's another electric motor in the back, but not the same electric motor that we find in the RX 350 apparently. Supposedly, this one is more powerful. Again, unfortunately, Lexus has a few details that they have not released yet. So for instance, we don't know whether the battery packs are identical, although we know that both vehicles use nickel metal hydride battery packs, not lithium ion battery packs. The design of this hybrid system makes sense when you think of this as a performance-oriented Lexus RX, just like the same reason that we find this same kind of hybrid in a Volvo XC90. The turbocharged engine gives us a lot of low-end torque. The automatic transmission gives us a very direct feel and a more traditional sporty feel as well. The electric motor up front can add a little bit of oomph to the system. Its primary job is to generate power for the rear electric motor and the battery pack, and also help start and stop the engine whenever it needs to. It's also there to help give you some regenerative braking ability on the front. The electric motor in the back gives this extra shove up to that 366 horsepower number. According to Lexus, all 3 RX models are going on sale at the same time towards the end of calendar year 2022. So RX 500h, 350h, and 350 all on sale at the same time. Now, a lot of folks had questions over on our Facebook channel, so let's just address some of them right here. Why a 6-speed automatic, not an 8-speed automatic? 2 logical reasons. The 6-speed is smaller and lighter than an 8-speed, and it doesn't need the extra gears as much. Here's why. First gear is not as low as in the 8-speed model because we have the electric motors. Doesn't need to be as low because we have all of that torque at 0 RPM. But 6th gear, it's just as high as the 8-speed, so it still gets excellent highway fuel economy. That's how this gets to 27 miles per gallon combined. The other question a lot of folks had was, why did they choose to use nickel metal hydride battery packs in these hybrids rather than lithium ion battery packs? That's also pretty logical. Both of these are regular hybrids, not plug-in hybrids. The plug-in hybrid will have a lithium-ion battery pack. But when we're talking about small batteries, like the batteries in these 2 non-plug-in hybrids, a lithium pack would not end up saving a lot of weight. And that's because a small lithium battery pack would need to be liquid cooled, just like we find in a lot of Ford hybrids. By the time you've added the cooling system, the extra cooling pumps, the plumbing, and the coolant itself, you've ended up right around the same kind of weight envelope that we find in a nickel metal pack, which can be simply air-cooled and stuffed under the rear seat. This design was designed from the ground up to have that battery pack under the rear seat, so it wasn't really too much of a packaging problem. Then obviously there's cost. Nickel metal packs are simply cheaper. Over a week of mixed driving, I found front seat comfort to be quite good. This seat is not as adjustable as some in this segment, however. This has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, no extending thigh cushion, although it does appear that the extending thigh cushion at least is going to be available at least in some trim of Lexus RX. I would love to see those 2 features standard. I was able to drive a European market plug-in hybrid that had both of those features, and it was definitely a more comfortable seat for me. We have a powered tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, 3-position memory over there on this section of the dashboard, no memory for the front passenger seat, although who knows, that could be coming in a later update because the European market model had it. Rear seat comfort is essentially identical between these 2 models. The battery pack is located right here under the rear seat. That may mean that the rear seat is slightly higher off the ground if you choose the hybrid model. We see that in some models from Toyota and Lexus. Whether or not it applies to this model, we don't know yet. I have about 5 inches of legroom, so definitely plenty of room back here. And a roomy second row is certainly the big reason to buy the RX over an X3, an XC60, etc. Because not only do we have more legroom than you'll find in the average European compact crossover, we have a lot more width. This is definitely a wider and bigger and comfier vehicle. So if you're a family, say, that has young children, you might want the RX over the NX or an X3 because you can fit child seats and adults back here, or a combination of them pretty easily. These second row seats also have a recline feature to them. You can either get this powered or manual. You can put these in a pretty upright position to square off the cargo area, or give yourself a reasonable amount of recline there. We also have available ventilated second row seats and 3-zone climate control. Cargo capacity is one of the specifications that Lexus has yet to release, although they have said that if you fold the second row seats, you'll get nearly 40 cubic feet of storage space. I expect this is going to be larger than the outgoing model because the outgoing RX honestly had a small cargo area for a vehicle this size. They were really prioritizing second row room, and they gave up a lot of cargo room for this swoopy profile in the rear. We still have a pretty raked rear glass, however, and that does compromise cargo practicality in the back. But the Lexus continues to have something unusual under the load floor, and that is an actual spare tire, something that we don't find in the vast majority of the competition. So if you're looking for a mid-size vehicle in this segment that has a spare tire, you're going to find it in here and in the F Sport Performance model both. So they don't have to delete the spare in order to give you that more powerful motor. The front seats get an embossed F Sport logo, moderate bolstering on the side and back cushion, and you can see that little insert of imitation suede there, perforated section in the middle for ventilation. We have lots of soft touch materials going on inside and kind of a tricolor scheme. The armrest, you can hardly see it there, is actually brown, not charcoal like the rest of the interior. We have lots of soft touch materials, but the lower part of the door, that is a hard touch plastic. One big surprise, the Lexus RX has always been known for having a lot of wood trim on the inside, and this generation has less. We have one wood trim strip over here on the passenger side. Just below that, we have a pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment. Then we have two large pieces of wood, in this case bamboo wood, right here in the center console. And then we have some wood trim strips on the steering wheel. That's basically it. Now, moving back over here to the dashboard, soft touch materials here, soft touch upper section, and then a stitched insert that matches what's going on the door. It's hard to see in this lighting, but right there under that sort of two-tier dash section, there's also going to be ambient lighting in that area to really illuminate that stitched component at night. Over here in the center, we have a 14-inch touchscreen infotainment system. The absolute base version of the RX is going to get a smaller LCD, but most of the models you'll be looking at will have this one. This supports wireless or wired Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. On the touchscreen, this is where we're going to find a lot of controls. I'm not the biggest fan of this, but we do have the heated and ventilated seat controls, heated steering wheel control right there. And if I go over here to this car icon, this is also where we find the drive mode selector. That's going to be a bit more important in the performance hybrid, of course. No physical button for those features. But we do have some buttons down here for the autonomous parking system, 360-degree camera. There's a little small storage slot right there, 2 USB ports. Under here, we find 2 more USB ports, regular USB and USB-C, Qi wireless charging mat in there, 2 pretty big cup holders, standard style joystick shifter, basically the same shifter we find in a number of other Lexus models, EV mode button there, brake hold button, and a pretty large storage area right there under that padded armrest. The big surprise in here, I think, is that over on the driver's side, we have a surprisingly small LCD instrument cluster. This is only 7 inches. This is by far the smallest LCD in this segment. Now, above it, we do have a full color heads-up display projected on the windshield through that little binnacle right there. And we have a very attractive steering wheel, but I do wish we had a bigger LCD cluster because this area is pretty large. And you can see this housing, it's quite large. It really accentuates, I think, the size or lack thereof of that LCD instrument cluster. These 2 little purple eyes you see staring at you, those are part of the driver monitoring system that's available in the RX. The steering wheel, again, has those wood inserts, touch buttons on either side. These are a combination of touch and physical buttons. You change what they do with this little button, and then in the heads-up display, it'll indicate what these options do when you touch them, and then you press them, and it's a physical button press. Moving over to the 500H, we find some imitation suede inserts on the doors and on the dashboard to dress this up a little bit differently. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but that is that imitation suede section right there on that upper section of the dashboard. Instead of the wood trim, we have aluminum trim only in this model. I am a little disappointed that there isn't a luxury version of the RX 500 because I think that would work really well with the mission here. We have the same LCD instrument cluster and same LCD infotainment system in the dashboard, same buttons going on down there, but again, just that aluminum trim. Because of the different mission of this hybrid system, you'll notice that it does not have an EV drive mode button, although it will operate in EV only mode, just not quite as often as the RX 350H. Above the steering wheel, we have the same driver monitoring system. No inserts as far as trim goes on the steering wheel, but perforated leather sections, big paddle shifters on the back, and this F Sport logo at the bottom. And a teeny tiny storage cubby to the left side of the steering wheel. Experience in your RX, you're going to want the hybrid, whether we're talking about this RX 350 hybrid or the upcoming plug-in hybrid, because this is the same hybrid system that we've seen out of Lexus for a while. Sometimes Lexus calls it a CVT, sometimes they shy away from that description. Right now they're back to calling this a CVT again. The big thing you should know is that it's not a CVT in the traditional sense. It's not a transmission in the traditional sense. There are two electric motors up front, one in the back, and between the three of them, they essentially act as a CVT. And that means that the electric motors are always involved in the locomotion of the vehicle. In reality, this feels more like an electric car in terms of the way that it accelerates than anything with a CVT or, of course, a traditional stepped automatic transmission. From a stop, the acceleration is very linear, and of course, you get that classic hybrid feel with the engine just hanging out there at a high RPM as you accelerate. Some folks are not really going to like that, but for others, it's not going to be a problem.
Because this is essentially the same hybrid system as you find in the Toyota Highlander or the Toyota RAV4, this is going to be very similar in terms of what you're hearing and feeling under acceleration.
Yeah.
But of course, we're dressed up in a nicer interior, a little bit more sound deadening here and there, and so it's a little bit quieter. But it's overall pretty refined. It's nothing...
Yeah, definitely quieter on the inside.
Yeah.
I would say that the Volvo XC90 T8 is definitely going to be more gruff. Its four-cylinder engine's never been as refined as the average in this segment, but you know, that's really the wave of the future here. We're seeing more and more bigger luxury vehicles, including SUVs, with four-cylinder turbos under the hood. This, of course, doesn't have a turbo, so this should be one of the most reliable, if not the most reliable drivetrain in this segment. As far as handling goes, all versions of the RX are tuned towards the softer side of things, but interesting twist, they all use the same tire size.
Yeah, I found that surprising, especially all the way up to the 500h F Sport Performance all-wheel drive. You still can't even get any wider than 235s. They are the Michelin Pilot Sport 4 SUV tires, so they are a little bit more hardcore. And
it gets more aggressive brakes as well. 6-piston brakes up front, so probably shorter stopping distance than the model that I'm driving right here. But that's not to say that any version of the RX is a slouch. This is certainly tuned towards the softer side of things, but you can have a surprising amount of fun out on a winding road like this. Just not as much fun as you'd get in the RX 500h or as much fun as you'd get in a BMW X5.
And one thing I noticed is the steering is definitely a little bit firmer than it used to be. It's not drastic. It's still kind of that somewhat numb feeling to it, but it's definitely got a little bit more heft to it than before. Again, nothing like any of the German competition or anything like that, but better than what it's been in the past.
And remember, nobody's power steering is what it was because everybody's electric power steering, so there's really not much feel going on in something like a BMW X5. But I agree that the steering feels a little bit better on center in something like the X5. That could be just because it's rear-wheel drive biased, so the front tires aren't being asked to do as much as they are in a Lexus RX. And that is one interesting twist with the 500h, but I'll talk about that in a second. In the 500, if you're turning onto a highway like this and you floor it, you get a lot of power right away, and you get a little bit of rear wheel stepping out there, and then you also get a little bit of torque steer. This is very, very similar to what we see in a Volvo XC90 T8 or the XC60 T8, and interestingly enough, a lot of all-electric vehicles too with dual motors. For instance, the BMW i4, it actually has kind of a similar feel there because you can get a lot of power on the rear axle, but then there's also a lot of power on the front and no mechanical connection between the front and the rear. And that's what gives you that sort of hint of torque steer while you're accelerating. This is also going to feel a little bit different than either the turbo-only model or the regular hybrid because of the design of this hybrid system. Rather than the traditional model where there's a momentary pause in acceleration as the transmission's shifting gears, this has the electric motor in the back, so it's always giving you that extra power while the transmission is running through the gears. So there's not that momentary sag in power that you'd find in a traditional model.
As expected, this one is much faster than the hybrid. My neck actually does... I do get thrown back into the back of my seat a little bit. There's definitely more oomph there at the beginning, like you said. And honestly, if you blindfolded me and sat me in this car and had me coasting down the road, I would have a hard time discerning which one this is because it kind of feels like the 6-speed automatic isn't a 6-speed automatic in the traditional sense. It definitely feels a little bit more buttery smooth. It's very much behind the scenes, from at least from my seating position. If you're at, if you're at the wheel, you definitely can tell a little bit more. But as a passenger,
the torque fill from the electric motor really helps smooth out those gear transitions. When you get this out on a windier section of the road and you put it in sport mode, you definitely get more of that imitation noise into the cabin. You can feel the rear steering doing its thing, but interestingly, we don't have a mechanical torque vectoring system on the rear axle. I think that could be kind of fun. We also don't find quite as much power on the rear axle, it would appear, as we find in the newest of the Volvo plug-in hybrids with the electric rear axle in the back. Probably the closest dynamic corollary to this vehicle. This is nearly 5,000 pounds of curb weight. So almost as heavy as some of the competitive plug-in hybrids in the European luxury set, with kind of a similar drivetrain design to that Volvo. One thing that surprised me is the way this vehicle uses the rear axle. It's always sending power to the rear much more aggressively than the regular hybrid model to help out the handling feel, and you will notice that out on the road. The other thing you'll notice is that the regenerative braking is much more mild than in the RX 350h. You really have to be slowing down quite rapidly, digging into the friction brakes already before the charge gauge will max out. So it's a little bit different than the RX 350 hybrid. Probably because we have that smaller electric motor up front than we find in the RX 350's drivetrain, and they don't want to do as much regenerative braking on the back. Dynamically, it's just not as good of an idea as having most of your regen on the front, so that's probably what's going on there. Lexus has said that up to 80% of drivetrain torque can go to the rear, 70% maximum to the front. Now, let's dissect that just a little bit. So we have that turbocharged engine up front, we have the electric motor at the back. Full-on max output, 70% of the power is happening on the front, 30% is happening on the rear. It can send more power to the rear axle depending on the situation, but that doesn't mean full throttle, 80% can go to the rear, because that motor is just not powerful enough. What Lexus means is that at lower speeds, if the wheel's turned in, that kind of thing, it will send more power to the rear to give you that rear biased feel, but really only at those lower total engine outputs. Remember, the power's all coming from the gasoline engine up front. It has to be generated by that electric motor, pulled from there or from the battery pack, and then sent out to the rear. But this nickel metal hydride battery pack, it's not as big as the big lithium ion packs that we find in plug-in hybrids, so it can't send as much continuous power to the rear without the gasoline engine being involved as we find in some plug-in hybrids. Turning around in these tighter maneuvers like that, you will definitely notice the tighter turning radius versus the model without the four-corner steering system. I really wish that other RX models would get the four-corner steer at some point, but they haven't really said if that's going to happen. Logically, if they've adapted it to this platform, they could adapt it to other variants of it. It's not something that's specific to this particular hybrid. It could be on the regular hybrid, it could be on the regular gas model. You will certainly notice the difference in tight parking lot maneuvers and out on the road. It definitely is going to make this easier to parallel park as well. Another interesting twist, only the F-Sport models get the adaptive suspension system, this F-Sport Performance and the regular F-Sport model.
And I think true to the agenda of this model, I think this one's a little bit more fun to drive in those curves, thanks to that setup, and also I think just the more power you have, that rear wheel steering, all those things combined, I can, even from the passenger seat, I can feel this is a little bit more nimble around the curve.
It feels a little bit more confident. And what's interesting is that it almost feels a little softer sometimes than the other F-Sport model that we drove. Even in this sport mode, and that's something that you notice about all the RXs, even in sport mode, even in the stiffest suspension setting, it is still pretty comfy, pretty compliant, pretty, wafting down the road.
It's almost like it's a little bit more mature, I'd say.
Yeah. It's, if you want something that is more firmly sprung, a little bit more nimble feeling, you're going to want the Lexus NX. That's definitely smaller than this. It's going to drive smaller. The RX sometimes, even in sport mode, even in this model, drives a little bit bigger than it really is. Over the last few years, Lexus has been accused of being a little bit late to the electrification party, but they would remind you that they were the first luxury car company to bring a hybrid to America with the original Lexus RX hybrid. The mission of that original RX hybrid was a bit split. It was focused on performance and fuel efficiency both. And rather than replicate that with a new hybrid, Lexus has decided to give us two. One focused on efficiency and one focused on performance with, of course, a dollop of efficiency on the side. Rather unfortunately, Lexus has not released pricing on either of these models. But if I had to guess, I would guess that the RX 350h is going to be less expensive than the outgoing Lexus RX hybrid because we get less power out of this hybrid system. My prediction's also based on the way that they've been talking about the RX 350h versus the RX 500h. This is obviously going to be the most expensive Lexus RX in the lineup. Expect this to be definitely over about $60,000 starting, so significantly more expensive than probably the effective price of a plug-in hybrid BMW X5 in the United States if you qualify for the federal tax credit. And that's going to be kind of a tricky thing. In this mid-size luxury crossover segment, all the hybrids are plug-in hybrids except for these two. We have the XC90 plug-in hybrid, the X5 plug-in hybrid, and soon perhaps a few more plug-in hybrids available. But as far as regular hybrids go, these two are the only two options. We no longer have an MDX hybrid, and there's no regular hybrid version of the Volvo or the BMW, etc. So if you're simply looking for luxury accommodations, a quiet cabin, a comfortable cabin, and high fuel economy, we have exactly one option in the Lexus RX 350h. If you don't have the ability to plug in or the desire to plug in, which is perfectly valid, if you just don't want to bother with plugging in, that is quite simply going to be the most efficient entry in this segment. Yes, you could end up using less gasoline in an X5 plug-in or an XC90 plug-in. They're going to be a little bit bigger, a little bit different. The XC90 is going to have 3 rows standard, and you're going to have to plug it in for that benefit. And at that point in time, you could just get something like this and get 27 miles per gallon, never have to plug it in either, but you aren't going to get that extra plug-in hybrid range or the power. And that is sort of the split here. The BMW and the Volvo are definitely very swift because they've got lots of power thanks to that plug-in hybrid battery pack. The Volvo, over 450 horsepower. This is nearly 100 horsepower less. So definitely a different performance category. But whether or not you qualify for the tax credit, whether or not we see one in the next generation XC90, we just don't know. Because you should keep in mind, the XC90 has already lost its federal tax credit. It's not built in North America. Whether or not the X5 will lose it next year, we don't know for sure. But if it's over $80,000, it's definitely not going to have it. And if its battery pack does not meet North American production requirements, it won't have that tax credit either. So that should definitely be on your mind if you're comparing this against a plug-in hybrid. Until we know more, keep in mind that these are two interesting options, but a lot of detail is still unknown. So hit that subscribe button down there. Stay tuned for all that data coming a little bit later. It's probably going to be after the videos have been released for either of these models. Otherwise, I'll just nip into the studio and you will see me suddenly in a studio talking about pricing. In the meantime, be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen. Find me over at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those social places. I'll see all of you next week.